What follows is a brief construction montage.
Flashback. End of flashback. Soon after. Moments later. Moments later. Moments later. More moments later.
Later.
Later. Later. Later. Later. Later. Later. Later. In the void.
Later that same evening.
Later that night.
The following Thursday. Yesterday. Meanwhile. Meanwhile.
Meanwhile.
Meanwhile.
Meanwhile.
At the Krusty Krab.
Meanwhile, back in the lowlands. Late again.
12 o'clock midnight. 3:28 a.m.
7:59 a.m.
8:01 p.m.
10 seconds later.
12 seconds later.
1 minute, 37 seconds later.
2 very boring minutes later. 5 minutes later.
5 minutes later.
5 minutes later. 11 minutes later. 15 minutes later.
20 minutes later.
A few minutes later.
A few minutes later.
A little longer than a few minutes later. Many, many minutes later.
1 hour later.
1 hour later. 1 hour later.
1 hour later.
1 hour later.
1 hour later.
2 hours later. 2 hours later.
2 hours later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later.
2 hours later.
2 hours later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later.
3 hours later.
3 hours later. 3 hours later. 3 hours later. 3 hours later. 5 hours later. 346 minutes later.
6 hours later.
6 hours later.
6.5 hours later.
7 hours later.
Several song-filled hours later.
8 hours later. 8 hours later. Approximately 10 hours later. 24 hours later. 24 hours later. Many hours later. Many unbearable hours later.
Tomorrow. Tomorrow for sure.
The following day.
The next day.
The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. Early the next morning. The next morning. The next morning.
The next morning.
The next morning. The next. The next morning. The next morning. The very next evening.
Day 2.
48 hours later. 2 days later.
Day 3.
72 hours later.
3 days later.
3 days later. 3 days later. 3 days later.
Day 4.
4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later.
Several days later.
1 week later. 1 week later. 1 weekend of pampering later. 2 weeks later. 16 paranoia-filled days later.
3 weeks later.
3 weeks later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 6 months later. 6 months later.
6 months later.
Several months later.
Many months later.
70 years later.
75 years later.
2,000 years later.
3,000 years later.
5 million years later.
Much later. Much, much later. Much, much later. Much, much, much later.
1 eternity later.
Just then, by sheer coincidence. Montage. You get the idea. Many tic-tacs later. 1 shift later. 1 shift later. 1 extremely annoying shift later.
A few moments later.
Thousands of tears later. 1 very long digestive tract later. 1 nap later. 1 long angry line later. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. 1 pathetic sob story later. 1 semester later. 8 semesters later. 1 season later. Many secret parties later. 1 little boost to the surface later.
5,000 celebrities later.
82 kilometers later. A little later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. Graduation day. A lot of boring math later. 1 frozen wasteland later. 1 winner later. Opening night. 298 frozen patties later. 1 debt to society later. 1 pair of pants later. Several bad puns later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
A few inches later.
Eventually. Epilogue. Epilogue.
We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage.